Hello and welcome to the last section of Chapter 38, The Stormy 60s for the American Pageant for U.S. History. We're looking at presidential sweepstakes in 1968. Basically, just doing one quick section just to wrap things up. So March 31st, 1968, President Johnson announces he is not running for re-election in 1968 for the presidency. Just 5 days after that, you have a tremendous tragedy when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed on April 4th, 1968. He was there in Memphis, Tennessee, planning a Poor People's March. African Americans who achieved great progress in terms of the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The only thing that was lacking really in the minds of the civil rights movement was economic equality, which Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to do. He was there actually protesting sanitation workers, a strike there in support. He was killed by James Earl Ray. There were riots all over the country in reaction to this. So 1968, just to review, opened with the seizure of the USS Pueblo by North Korea. You have the Tet Offensive. You have the president not running for re-election. You have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated. You have riots across the country. And the presidential race still continues. Vice President Hubert Humphrey joins, who, if he wins the nomination, is just a continuation of what LBJ was doing. Nothing. It's kind of the status quo for Vietnam. Robert Kennedy emerges as the front runner, the younger brother of President Kennedy, the former Attorney General. After winning the California primary, he is murdered on June 5th, 1968 by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian. And so the Democratic race is thrown into disarray. The Democratic convention, fast forward just a couple months in August, it looked like Robert Kennedy was going to win the nomination. At the convention, the mayor, Richard Daley, vowed to keep protesters in line. He wasn't going to let the hippies and the dope-smoking people, as he called them, do what they wanted. There are riots outside of Chicago Stadium where the Chicago Bulls and Blackhawks play. Humphrey wins the nomination. There's all-out riots breaking loose. It's all televised, and so violence really overshadows and mires the entire Democratic campaign. It ruins Humphrey's candidacy. This is video of the President Kennedy assassination.
Bobby's wilderness years began. He became convinced that America should withdraw from Vietnam. In his presidential bid, removing troops from Vietnam became a priority. He spelled it out in his final interview, given minutes before he was shot.
Had more Americans killed there in the last several weeks than any time during the war. We're now, 6 months ago, we were talking about bombing Hanoi and concerned about that because we're going to kill civilians. Now we're killing large numbers of them as we bomb Saigon. I just think that we just have to change our policies. I would hope that the Democratic Party would recognize that.
So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Protesters outside Chicago Stadium, Chicago, really mire the Democratic cause. Most Americans are not protesters. Most Americans don't march. Most Americans at that time wish for law and order. You have George Wallace, the guy that once said, "I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever," from Alabama, vowed to crack down on the long-haired draft card burning youth, which appealed to a lot of people. But you have the silent majority. You have the resurgence of Richard Nixon, who comes back for the Republicans. He appealed to the silent majority, the quiet voice of America that did not protest. They just went about their business and worked. and did their jobs and didn't have time to go, make signs and burn draft cards. He was extremely vague when asked about Vietnam. He said a 3-word phrase, peace with honor. And so for the Doves, they heard peace and they got excited. For the Hawks, they heard with honor. That means you can't just leave Vietnam. Didn't really spell out in the campaign how he's going to achieve peace with honor, but it is a brilliant political move. On election day, Nixon only wins by 500,000 votes. It is an extremely close election, and people have often wondered if Robert Kennedy had won, what would happen, how Vietnam would have turned out differently. He only gets 43.2% of the vote, and so that's the popular vote. That's not a mandate from the people, but he does win the presidency. He wins by a larger margin in the Electoral College, as you can see here. Everything blue went to Nixon, the red went to Humphrey, and this dark red kind of went to Wallace, the American Independent Party. And so looking at LBJ, no president since Lincoln had done more for civil rights than LBJ. He's arguably the greatest domestic president in modern times. He passed more pieces of modern legislation than any other president. But the Vietnam War overshadows everything he did. It sucked tax dollars away from his Great Society programs, and it overshadows everything he tried to do. And his name becomes synonymous with Vietnam, even though he did wonderful, great things that are still around to this day. It's all we got one more, sorry. So you have this cultural upheaval of the 60s. You have the free speech movement was one of the first organized protests against established authority. This was centered at the University of California at Berkeley in 1964. From the 50s to the 70s, educated people became more secular and uneducated people became more religious. Protests against government took place around the world, including in France and China, Czechoslovakia. The 1960s also witnesses a sexual revolution. The birth control pill was approved by the FDA in 1964, effectively ending the baby boom. There's the idea of free love, that the institution of marriage is no longer needed. You have the Stonewall Rebellion, which was a series of riots that emerged when an off-duty police officer attacked gay men in New York City, kind of starting the gay rights movement in the 60s and in the 70s. By the end of the 60s, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, had created an underground terrorist group called Weathermen. There's upheavals of the 60s that could be attributed to 3 Ps: youthful population, protests against racism, the Vietnam, and apparent permanence of prosperity. And so that's all the changes. The 1960s are crazy. We're not done with it. We'll get to the end of Vietnam in our next chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know.